I welcome all the viewers to my channel. I hope you're all doing well. If you're interested in watching boring history in a new way, make sure to subscribe to the channel. And if you enjoy the video, don't forget to like and share it too. Before we begin, I invite you to settle in. Let your shoulders drop just a little deeper into the mattress. Let your jaw loosen, let your breath soften. You are safe now, everything can wait. This is your time to rest, to drift, to be still. Take a slow breath in, hold it gently, and let it out like a leaf floating down from an autumn tree. Another breath in and out. Feel your hands grow heavy. Feel the world soften around you. Let your thoughts settle, like dust on a quiet chapel floor. Now that you're here, warm and relaxed, let me tell you a story. Our story begins behind a wall, hidden in a quiet corner of the hills. The wall is old, covered in moss, and tucked behind a small convent where silence is treasured and the days unfold slowly. Like prayers whispered before sleep, the stones of the wall are smooth from centuries of weather. Vines crawl gently over the surface, their tendrils soft and green, curling down in sleepy spirals. On the other side, sheltered and unseen, rests a garden. Not a garden for vegetables or roses, but a secret place, overgrown, peaceful, and made only for dusk. The convent itself is simple, its stone arches softened by ivy and time. Bells ring softly every hour, each tone floating into the air like a lullaby. Inside, the nuns move quietly. They rise with the dawn, they sew robes in the afternoon light. They pray with folded hands, and though many of them know of the garden, none speak of it aloud. It is a place you find, not a place you search for. Long ago, it was said that one of the first sisters who lived in the convent planted it herself. She believed that certain herbs should never be touched by sunlight. That moonlight made them more gentle and more dreamy. She would walk the garden barefoot in the evenings, brushing her hands over the leaves, whispering as she went. No one remembers her name now, but the plants she planted still bloom. Even after all these years, the garden is hidden by an iron gate, woven with ivy. Most days, it looks like nothing more than another part of the wall. But when dusk begins to settle, and the sky dims to a deep lavender gray, the gate loosens. It opens without a sound, as if it's been waiting. Step inside, and the air changes. It is cooler here, but not cold. The air carries the scent of damp earth, crushed petals, and something sweet, maybe lavender, or maybe a flower that has no name. The ground is soft beneath your feet, padded with moss and old fallen leaves that crumble like paper under gentle steps. There are no paths in the garden. The plants grow where they please. Tall, feathery stalks of fennel lean against the wind. Pale violet flowers open only when touched by moonlight. Low sprigs of thyme wind in slow, sleepy spirals across the ground. You don't need to know where to go. The garden will guide you. Near the center grows a fig tree with twisted limbs and a thick hollow trunk. Its bark is pale and warm, and the tree itself smells faintly of fruit and wood smoke. Beneath its branches is a bench, carved from old wood, and smooth from time. No one built it. It has always been there. When you sit, the tree seems to lean closer, as if listening. Around the fig tree, the herbs bloom, not in rows, not in tidy beds, but in quiet clusters. Chamomile glows, soft yellow in the moonlight, its tiny blossoms swaying gently. Valerian grows tall and sleepy, its flowers small and pink, nodding like drowsy heads. Angelica stands strong. Nearby, its white blossoms like lace spread across the air. In medieval times, the sisters believed that these herbs held special powers, not for magic, not for spells, but for dreams. Chamomile to soften the mind, valerian to still the body, angelica to protect against troubled thoughts. They called it night medicine, and it was given not in bottles or teas, but by placing a sprig beneath a pillow or tying a sachet with ribbon before sleep. Farther along, you'll find lemon balm, sweet and citrus-scented, curling up the stones like a cat curling into a lap. It was once believed to bring joy to the heart and calm to the soul. Nuns would tuck the leaves into the folds of their sleeves before bedtime, hoping to carry its comfort into sleep. The garden holds no lanterns, no candles. It needs no light other than the moon. Fireflies sometimes drift through, blinking softly between the leaves. Their glow is gentle, like distant stars caught in the hedges. At the far edge of the garden, where the trees thicken and the ground darkens with fallen pine needles, a narrow stream runs through. Its water is cold and clear, slipping over smooth, stones and carrying the hush of the forest with it. The nuns do not visit this part of the garden often, but it is said that on quiet nights, if you listen closely, the water hums like a hymn. There is no sound of voices here, no footsteps, only the slow rustle of leaves, the low murmur of water, the hum of bees tucked into hives near the almond trees. It is a place made for listening, not speaking. Even your thoughts begin to soften. They stretch out like branches, drifting wider and slower, until they no longer feel like thoughts at all, just warmth. Somewhere nearby, a low chime rings from the convent tower, one soft bell. The hour passes, but you do not feel it. In the garden, time does not move in hours. It moves in petals opening, in the slow curl of vines, in the deepening color of the sky. As you rest on the bench beneath the fig tree, the air grows sweeter. A breeze stirs the leaves. The flowers do not close, not yet. They wait for you. They bloom for you. They sway in a rhythm that matches your breath. You are safe here. You are welcome. The garden behind the wall remembers everyone who visits. It holds each breath like a secret. And tonight, it holds yours too. The old bell in the convent tower gave a soft, distant chime. It rang not with urgency, but with a gentle hush, as though it whispered to the evening rather than called. One low note, then silence, then another. And with each tone, the sisters of the convent began to move slowly through the cloister, their sandals brushing over the cool stone in unhurried rhythm. Sister Ida closed the wooden gate behind her and placed the iron key back on its hook. She moved through the herb walkway with practiced ease. Her hands, though calloused from years of garden work, passed gently across the leaves of the mint and rosemary. They shimmered faintly under the sky's growing lavender hue. The air was cool, and a hush lay over the stones. Even the bees seemed quieter at dusk. There was something about this hour, just after the sun had dipped below the hills, that made the garden seem enchanted. It wasn't just the way the shadows pooled at the base of the old stone walls, or how the light caught the dew on the petals. It was something older, something the younger novices only began to feel after many seasons tending the soil. A paused by the lavender row, and her fingers found a tiny bud she had been watching for days. It had bloomed, pale and almost silver in the dusk. It gave off the softest perfume. She cupped it with reverence, inhaling its sleepy scent. In medieval herb lore, lavender was believed to calm the restless mind and guard dreams from disturbance. She whispered a prayer, not with words, but with breath. Far off, a robin gave a single chirrup, then fell silent. Sister Edda continued, toward the back wall of the garden, where the oldest plants lived. Here, behind the vine-draped archway, the garden was less ordered. It had grown wild over the years, but the sisters did not mind. In fact, they welcomed it. There was an old belief, one passed down from abbess to abbess, that certain plants only thrived where human order was absent. The night-blooming primrose glowed, faintly as if kissed by moonlight before the moon had even risen. Its petals opened with a slow yawn, as though it, too, was ready for sleep. Soft winds moved through the elder trees at the far corner. The leaves gave off a gentle rustle, like old hands brushing cloth. And there, beneath the oldest fig tree, nestled in a bed of thyme and foxglove, lay the stone bench, worn smooth from centuries of sitting. It curved slightly from age. Ida took her seat there every evening, not to work, not to think, but to listen. Some evenings, the garden sang not with music, but with presence. The scent of crushed lemon balm, the hum of bees returning home, the distant cluck of hens preparing for sleep. It was a lullaby woven not of sound, but of quiet things. A long breath escaped her lips. Even Sister Ida, so used to the rhythm of the cloister, felt something stir in her chest each time she sat here. A slowing of thoughts, a deepening of silence. She closed her eyes. Behind the convent wall, the world drifted further away. Long ago, before Sister Ida had first arrived at the convent, the garden was tended by a woman known only in the records as Sister Miriam. Her name was carved in a faded script on one of the garden's stone planters, where moss now softened the letters. No one remembered her face, but they remembered her herbs. She had believed quietly, patiently, that certain plants did more than heal the body. They opened the heart to dreaming. The convent records held notes in her own hand, curved, careful letters written on pages pressed from linen and stitched into the garden journal. Pages with recipes for dream bombs and moon brews, lavender for rest, chamomile for peace, Mugwort, for Journeys of the Soul. Edda had read those pages many times, always by candlelight, always with her thumb tucked beneath the edge of the parchment, like she might unfold something deeper. Now she sat beneath the fig tree, where Sister Miriam was said to have prayed each dusk. A little cluster of mugwort grew there still, though no one had planted it for years. It grew where it chose, stubborn and silver-green, brushing the edge of Thepeth like a sleeping cat. The air was thicker now, cool and moist, the way it often felt before a summer night deepened. A breeze passed across the garden, brushing through the rows of herbs, like a soft, unseen hand. Ida could hear the softest tinkling sound, the tiny chimes someone had hung from the arbor above the thyme bed. They caught the wind gently, singing notes too small to disturb, too delicate to notice, unless you were very still. She remained where she was, her hands resting in her lap, palms up. Around her, the night garden began to stir in its quiet way, not with motion, but with presence. There was a warmth in the earth below, holding the sun's memory. There was the sweet, rich scent of marjoram, which always seemed stronger in the dark, and high above, a thin crescent moon began to show through the shifting branches. The convent bell had long since fallen silent. No more footsteps echoed through the cloister. The sisters were in their cells now, reading, praying, sleeping, but Ida remained. The garden was her prayer. She remembered something from the old journal, one of Sister Miriam's final entries. There are things that only come alive when no one is watching. Flowers that only bloom in the quiet mind. Scents that only appear when the world forgets its name. And here, under the faint moonlight, Ida understood. This garden was not just soil and stem. It was a place where silence grew thick as leaves. A place where the mind could wander without fear. She looked toward the wall. The ivy had crept farther than usual this season, curling into the corners like green ink spreading across a page. A small moth fluttered nearby, soft and white, moving from blossom to blossom with velvet wings. The garden, in this hour, belonged to no one. Not to time, not to duty, only to stillness. And so Ida closed her eyes again, not to sleep just yet, but to let her thoughts fall like petals, one by one, into the hush. The earth held her gently, like an old friend, and above her, the stars began to arrive. Inside the convent scriptorium. The hours were measured by a single wax candle. Tall and narrow, it burned at a known pace, and small brass pins had been set into its side to mark the divisions. When the wax melted and a pin clinked softly into the metal dish beneath it, the sisters would rise for the next prayer. But out in the garden, time was measured differently. It drifted in the rhythm of leaves swaying, in the gentle hush between bees, wings. In the length of a shadow slipping slowly across the path. Sister Ida had come to know those hours, not with the mind, but with the skin and the senses. She could tell when dusk truly began, not when the sun vanished, but when the birds fell silent and the warm golden glow turned pale and blue. She stood now near the rosemary hedge, which curved along the edge of the garden like a line drawn in dark ink. The sharp, resinous scent lifted into the air as she brushed her fingertips lightly across it. She remembered something an older sister once told her. Rosemary is for memory, but only if you handle it gently. At her feet, a cat had curled into the lavender, purring faintly. It was one of the garden's regulars, pale grey with white paws. No one knew where it came from, but it never strayed far from the convent wall. Ida bent slowly, resting on her knees beside it, her fingers trailing through the silky grass. The breeze shifted again, and the vines above the arbor whispered. A bell in the distance chimed once the village chapel, far beyond the fields. A soft, lonesome tone carried over the low hills. And in the fading light, the garden changed color. Greens deepened into velvet black. White petals glowed faintly like drops of milk scattered across the earth. The walls around the convent turned, a quiet grey-blue, and the sky above slowly melted from amber into indigo. Ida turned toward the garden's center. There, at the very heart of it, stood the old sundial, worn smooth from centuries of wind and rain. Its markings were nearly gone, but its shape remained, a circle within a circle, casting no clear shadow now. She stepped toward it with care. A memory flickered in her mind, one from her early novitiate days. She had been barely 17 then, brought to the convent by an uncle who believed she needed stillness more than books. She remembered how afraid she had been of silence. Now she cherished it. The sundial's base was overgrown with creeping time. She brushed some of it back and found, tucked beneath the rim, a small wooden box, weathered, unlocked. The lid slid open with barely a sound. Inside were folded scraps of parchment, tiny notes, no longer than a thumb. Messages, perhaps, or prayers. Someone had left them here. Ida lifted one carefully. The ink was faded, but the writing was neat. "Let the night teach me how to rest." She pressed the words to her chest for a moment, and then folded them gently back inside. The stars were brighter. Now, the candle of ours inside the convent would soon be burned to its third pin. But here, in the garden, there was no need for such measures. Here, time drifted like mist over petals, soft and unhurried, and Edda stood still, letting herself disappear into the quiet rhythm of leaves. Not every sister came to the garden for peace. Some came in search of answers. Sister Maris was one of them. She was the convent's apothecary, quiet and slender, always with a smudge of soil beneath her nails and a ribbon of dried mint tucked into her sleeve. She believed that every flower had a language of its own, not only in symbol, but in tone and rhythm, as if plants whispered truths through color and scent. Each morning she walked the outer paths of the garden with a linen pouch, collecting petals, roots, or seeds left fresh from the dew. She rarely spoke unless she had something certain to say, but in the garden she was never silent. Her hands moved, constantly touching leaves, feeling the weight of stems, brushing pollen from bud to bud. Tonight, she returned just before the final bell. When the sky was layered in lilac and silver, the garden greeted her like an old friend. She stepped barefoot down the eastern path, where the evening primrose had begun to open. One by one, their pale yellow cups unfurled toward the fading light, as if summoned by her presence. She knelt there, fingertips brushing the petals. "They only bloom in the last light," she murmured. "Dream flowers, messengers." She reached into her satchel and drew out a sheet of vellum, carefully drawn with circles and strange curved lines, her own coded diagrams of the garden's herbal cycle. Where the novice sisters saw weeds or beauty, Maris saw timing, combinations, sleep, vision, release. At the edge of the path, tall blue borage swayed gently, and beside it, a low bed of valerian trembled in the wind. Both were prized by the convent's healer, but Maris knew to take only the leaves on the left side of the stalk, and only during the waning moon. The bell tolled once in the distance. She turned toward the arbor, the same one Sister Edda had passed earlier. The scent there was different, no richer, more humid. The garden breathed with the hour, shifting in tone as the stars crept higher. Maris paused before a cluster of moonwort. The silvery ferns shimmered faintly in the darkness, their spoon-shaped leaves catching moonlight in a way that looked like old coins. She whispered to them, as she always did, opened the path between waking and sleep. "Show me the gate." No one else ever heard her speak those words. No one else knew she kept a journal hidden behind the herbarium shelf in the apothecary room, a worn book filled with her findings. Which leaves brought calm, which petals deepened dreams, which roots made the soul wander through visions of fire or water. Some of the sisters would have called it superstition, others might have whispered the word forbidden. But Maris never sought permission. She followed the plants, and the plants spoke back. A soft wind stirred the vines above her head, and she turned toward the oldest fig tree in the garden. Its gnarled limbs reached outward like arms. At its base was a mossy patch where time grew wild and untamed. She sat there cross-legged and opened. Her small wooden bowl. Inside was a pinch of dried rose petals, a shaving of bark from the willow, and 3 tiny seeds the color of night. She mixed them gently, crushed them between her fingers, and inhaled. The scent was earthy and ancient. A memory passed through her, a dream she'd once had, years ago, of a tower by the sea and bells ringing beneath water. It had come to her after sleeping. Beside this very tree, she tucked the bowl away and let her eyes drift closed. Some dreams, she believed, did not come from within. They arrived from the roots of the earth itself, passed upward through stem and sap, finally blooming behind the eyes of those willing to listen. And so, beneath the sheltering branches of the old fig, Sister Maris listened. She did not seek rest, not like Ida did. She sought the message within the stillness. The night deepened, and the garden held her in silence. In the still hours past, the convent had its own hush. Even the walls seemed to sleep. But inside a narrow chamber near the herbarium, lit only by the faint glow of a beeswax taper. Sister Maris opened her secret book. She called it the Book of Fragrance, though it had no title on the cover. Its leather had worn soft with age, its corners curled like petals after rain. Within its pages were pressed herbs and inked lines, written in a steady hand. Her own dot. It was not a book meant for others, not for the Mother Abbess, not for the archives. It was for her and the garden alone. She turned to a fresh page, laid her quill upon the inkwell, and began to write in silence. Tonight the moonwort gleamed more brightly than I've ever seen. The fig tree's leaves rustled with sleep, but the valerian leaned toward the stars. Something stirred in the soil, a dream rising. She paused and dipped the quill again. Then she added, I have placed the new blend near the base of the arbor. If Sister Edda passes by again, it may help her. She carries too much sorrow in her shoulders. Closing the book gently, she exhaled, a long, steady breath, like wind leaving the body. On a shelf above her head sat tiny jars with wax-sealed lids, each labeled in her code. Powdered poppy husk, crushed lemon balm, a wisp of dried angelica root. The air smelled of lavender and old parchment. She took a moment to warm her fingers near the candle. Then, with great care, she gathered a handful of dried blooms and dropped them into a small cloth sachet. She would leave it under Edda's pillow. No one would notice. No one would ask. That was the quiet beauty of the garden. It whispered, not demanded. It offered without taking. And in that spirit, Maris moved like a ghost through the corridor, her feet bare, her shadow long. Back in the garden, the wind shifted. Beyond the arbor, down a sloping trail of moss and crushed sage, lay the garden's oldest corner. Few sisters came here. It was overgrown, a tumble of stone and ivy, a hollow space between two leaning walls where sun rarely reached, and the breeze was always cool. But Maris came often. She believed the dreams were strongest here, because this was where the convent had first been planted, generations ago. Before the walls rose tall and the chapel bells were hung, the original nuns had camped here beneath the trees. They had dug with their own hands. They had prayed in the open air. They had laid the first stones in silence. Maris knelt at the foot of a half-buried marble marker. Its inscription had worn away, but the ivy around it grew thick and sweet. She traced a finger over the cold surface and whispered a blessing. Then she lit a sprig of rosemary at the edge of her candle's flame. Smoke curled into the air, fragrant and clean. She held the burning sprig in the still air and let the scent carry upward. Let rest come to those who wait, she said softly. And, somewhere, in the breeze that stirred the edges of the fig tree's crown, something stirred in reply. Not a word, not a voice, just presence. Just peace. Each evening, just after the bell of Compline faded into silence, Sister Ida walked the lantern path. It was not a rule. No one asked her to, but for many years now, she had walked it anyway. The path curved along the southern edge of the convent's inner wall. Small oil lanterns sat upon short posts, spaced evenly, their flames protected by hand-blown glass. Each lantern gave off a soft golden shimmer, flickering gently in the breeze. Edda's steps were slow, not from age, but from listening. She liked to hear how the wind rustled the tall stalks of fennel and dill. She liked how her sandals brushed over stone and moss, how the fireflies blinked near the hedge like soft, living stars. Some nights, she would pass Sister Maris near the arbor and simply nod. Words were never needed between them. Tonight, however, the lanterns seemed especially warm. Their light hugged the low wall-like arms. Edda paused near the third lantern and looked down. There, tucked beside the base, was a tiny sprig of dried mint wrapped in cloth. She smiled faintly and picked it up. Someone remembered, not just the plant, but the memory. Mint was her mother's herb. Long ago, before she ever took her vows, her mother would steep mint into warm milk when sleep was far away. Now the scent rose like a ghost, curling into her thoughts, softening the lines across her brow. She didn't speak aloud. Instead, she held the sprig gently, cradled it in both palms, and pressed it to her heart for a moment. Farther down the path, the fig trees moved in the breeze. She continued walking, slower now, as if the earth beneath her feet was made of cloud. Past the last lantern, the path opened onto a circular garden bed. This was the dreaming ringer place. Only a few sisters tended. Each spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it the soul's compass. Ida stood at its edge and inhaled. The scents were layered: thyme, chamomile, rose, ash from burnt sage, and something else, something faint and old, like memory buried in bark. She closed her eyes and tilted her face to the sky. Above her, clouds drifted slowly past the moon. Its light shimmered through them, pearly and soft. "Let me carry less," she whispered. And the garden, as always, listened without question. She sat cross-legged on the edge of the ring and let the quiet do what it does best: soothe, untangle, and forgive. No bells, no duties, no voices. Just the hush of plants and time. And when she stood again, her hands were lighter, and her breath was deeper. The mint sprig still rested in her pocket, nestled like a secret beside her rosary. In the stillness of early afternoon, when the sun reached the high arches and cast slender beams across the stone floor, the scriptorium grew quiet, not silent, ever quite silent, but filled with a hush shaped by focus, ink, and breath. Sister Alina sat by the tall eastern window, the one that overlooked the topmost stretch of the convent wall. Just beyond that wall lay the garden, but from here it was seen only in glimpses: a climbing vine, a shimmer of green, the flutter of petals in wind. The light that came through this window was different. It passed through pale yellow glass, smoothed and softened by time, and when it touched the pages on her desk, it made the vellum glow faintly, as though the prayers she copied were already lit from within. She dipped her quill slowly into the ink. The scent of the pigment, rose-iron gall and crushed oak galls, aged with wine and soot. It was old, familiar, and oddly grounding. Each letter she wrote was a prayer, not just the words, but the shape of them, the weight of the curves, the way ink settled into the grain. Outside, the breeze stirred the leaves, and a single petal from the honeysuckle floated up, and then down again, vanishing from view. Alina paused her writing. Her fingers brushed the small sachet of dried lemon balm that rested beside the ink jar. She always kept it near. The scent helped her steady her thoughts when they wandered too far into dreams. The sachet had been given to her by Sister Imelda, who claimed lemon balm could keep sorrow from rooting too deeply. She didn't always believe such things, but today the soft fragrance did seem to lift the weight in her chest just slightly. A soft knock came at the scriptorium door. Then it opened without sound. It was Sister Ennis. She carried a shallow wooden bowl wrapped in linen. "For your eyes," she said in a whisper, setting it down. "Rosewater, from the garden." Alina smiled and thanked her with a nod. When the door closed again, she peeled back the cloth. Inside was cool water, tinged with blush pink, and floating within it delicate petals, open and serene. She dipped a cloth into the water and pressed it gently to her eyes. Coolness bloomed behind her lids. All around her, the hush of the scriptorium held steady, patient and unchanging in the quiet. She imagined the garden behind the wall, not as a place to be visited, but as a breath within her, blooming slowly, gently, across the page and between the words. And when she returned to her writing, the ink seemed darker, the page brighter, and her hands, somehow, steadier than before. The path that wound behind the convent wall was not laid with brick or carved stone. It was simpler, narrow track of pale river pebbles, worn smooth by years of patient steps. Each pebble, Sister Imelda once said, had been gathered with care from the stream beyond the orchard, chosen not just for its shape but for the way it caught light after rain. The path began beneath an old wooden arch, draped in ivy and morning glory, and led slowly, very slowly toward the far end of the garden, where elder trees and yew hedges stood in silence. Sister Catherine walked there now, barefoot. The pebbles were warm beneath her soles, warmed by the sun but cooled here and there by shade. Each step a soft click, a whisper, a nudge into presence. She didn't hurry. No one ever hurried in the garden. The air was scented with lavender and fennel, with rosemary and thyme, but also with something earthier: soil, bark, the faint salt of old stone. As she passed the tall fennel stalks, bees stirred lazily around. Her sleeves, drunk on nectar, too gentle to fear. She carried a small bundle in her hands, a strip of linen folded over dried rose hips and calendula harvested earlier in the morning and left to rest in the sun. At the bend in the path, she paused. A cluster of forget-me-nots had sprung up beside the edge of the hedge, tiny and blue, unnoticed until now. She crouched to observe them, her fingers brushing the tips lightly. Reverently, she whispered a blessing, not aloud but in her heart. a habit the sisters had. Small blessings for small things. A ladybug crawled over her wrist. The wind stirred, lifting her veil just slightly. It moved the garden with its leaves rustling in layers, like turning pages, petals fluttering down from the high boughs above. Voices singing a hymn in sleep. She continued walking, slower now. The pebbles clicked again beneath her feet, and she began counting them, not in number, but in feeling. 1 for calm, 1 for breath, 1 for kindness, 1 for stillness. There was something soothing about it, like the rhythm of prayer beads, or the ticking of a clock without urgency. At the end of the path there stood a bench carved from a single piece of ashwood. No ornament, no carving, just the smooth shape of a seat worn by years of contemplation. She sat. From here, the garden stretched out in gentle circles, all color and shadow and warmth. The bell tower above cast no shadow here. Time slowed its reach. She unfolded her linen, letting the petals fall into her lap. They were dry now, ready for the jar, ready to steep into oils, into tinctures, into quiet dreams. But for now, she simply sat, listening. To birdsong, to wind, to nothing, to everything. In the soft hush of afternoon, the garden listened for the bell. It did not ring loud like the tower chime at Lauds or Vespers. This bell was smaller, older, cast in brass, with a thin rope wrapped in faded blue linen. It hung just beside the apothecary door, swaying gently with the wind. Its chime barely more than a sigh. It was Sister Magda who kept the garden's bell. They called her the herb keeper. She had tended the plots long before most of the others arrived. Her hands knew every stem, every root, every hidden patch where chamomile grew wild along the edge of the stones. She wore layers of flax-dyed wool, always patched at the elbows, always dusted in pollen or specks of dried thyme. Her eyes were pale and calm, like the surface of a pond just before twilight. That day, she stepped from her little room behind the cloister and walked slowly to the bell. With one hand, she touched the rope, but with the other, she held a bowl wide and shallow, carved from olive wood and lined with linen. Inside it lay a scattering of white blossoms, elderflower, sweet woodruff, a single sprig of angelica. She gave the rope a gentle pull. The bell rang once, soft, clear, barely. There its sound drifted across the garden like smoke from a quiet fire, curling through the hedges, slipping beneath the boughs, brushing gently against the stone wall. Sister Katrine heard it, and so did the others, wherever they were, in the stillness of their day. It meant only one thing: the dream herbs were ready. At the far end of the garden, beside the low wall where moss climbed in silver patches, a wooden frame had been set out in the sun, there covered in gauze to keep the bees at bay. Bundles of herbs had been drying for days: lemon balm, mugwort, violet, a pinch of valerian, though, sparingly, it was too powerful in excess. These were the herbs the sisters used in their tinctures for dream rest, brewed only once the moon reached its highest point in the sky, and always taken in silence. They did not speak much about what dreams came. That was not the point. It was enough to know the garden gave something sacred, something soft. Sister Magda reached the drying frame and lifted the gauze with care. The scent rose instantly, earthy, bitter, tinged with floral sweetness. She picked each bundle gently, laying them into her wooden bowl. Her footsteps never hurried, though the sun had begun its descent. Shadows stretched across the lavender rose. Somewhere, a bird called twice. She made her way to the old stone basin near the center of the garden, the place where rainwater collected and frogs sometimes hid beneath the ferns. There, she rinsed her hands, not just to clean them, but to mark the transition from tending to preparing, from daylight to dusk. A quiet ritual, a soft moment of turning. The wind picked up slightly, fluttering the corners of her linen shawl. She looked up briefly. The top of the convent wall, the sky beyond had begun to dim, painted in pale violet and muted gold. The garden was entering its most sacred time. As dusk deepened, the garden became a world of stillness. The last of the sunlight slipped behind the convent roof, casting long shadows through the herb beds. The rosemary looked like little hedged hills in the fading light, and the old pear tree stood quietly in the corner, its leaves unmoving, as if holding its breath. The stone basin, worn by time and water, held the first silver reflections of the moon. Sister Magda stood beside it, her wooden bowl resting on the rim. The dream herbs lay inside, softened by the cooling air. The scent of mugwort, with its bitter edge, now mingled with the sweet memory of wildflowers. Clinging to her sleeves, she cupped a bit of water from the basin and let it fall through her fingers. This water had no special blessing, no oils, no spoken words, yet it held a kind of grace in its simplicity. Rain that had gathered, time that had passed, quiet that had settled. Around her, the convent remained hushed. The sisters were in their cells or moving gently through evening chores, their footsteps barely a whisper against the stone floors. But the garden, this space behind the convent wall, was something else entirely. It had no stone rules, no iron bells, no manuscripts to scribe. Its rhythm was not written in ink, but in roots and sun and breath. Its wisdom, older than any prayer book, was found in the softness of petals opening at night, in the hum of bees retreating into their hives. Sister Magda took the herbs inside, into the apothecary chamber where she kept the dried bundles, the oil-stained papers, the old copper kettle blackened with time. The room smelled of rosemary and pressed beeswax. Shelves were lined with tiny glass vials, some clear, others cloudy. Wax-sealed jars rested in rows, marked only with initials: MB for marjoram bomb, CD for clover decoction, HT for the tea of heart's ease. She placed the new herbs onto a wide cloth laid on the table, and began sorting them with her fingers. No blade, no metal, only touch, only care. Outside, the moon had fully risen. It hovered above the wall, casting a soft blue light over the garden, touching the top of the hedges and the old sundial with its cracked face and unreadable numbers. This was the hour when the sisters who needed rest would come. They never spoke as they arrived. One by one, they passed through the wooden door near the bell and entered the apothecary. Some carried small clay cups, others brought nothing but silence and tired eyes. Sister Magda prepared their teas with the quiet movements of someone who knew what was needed before a word was spoken. She added the tiniest pinch of lemon balm for those burdened by thought, a flake of violet petal for those whose dreams had grown sharp. She never asked questions, she never needed to. They sat near the hearth, where a single ember glowed like the eye of a sleepy fox. The cups were warmed, the steam rising in faint curls. Hands wrapped gently around the clay, as if holding something delicate and necessary. And in that quiet chamber, behind the mossy garden wall, rest began. Not with sleep, not yet, but with the simple act of stopping, of holding still, of tasting something, warm and herbal in the hush of night. While the sisters rested in the flickering warmth of the apothecary, the garden beyond the stone wall seemed to breathe in the moonlight. Each blossom, each stem, opened just a little more, as if the dark sky above whispered secrets only plants could understand. The tall angelica leaves shimmered faintly with dew. The small white blossoms of valerian tilted toward the sky, pale as lace in the moon's glow. Even the old wooden gate, rarely opened, seemed to hum with a kind of memory, not of footsteps or voices, but of wind and bees, of rainwater slipping between the hinges, of time passing like soft footsteps in the grass. Sister Magda stepped outside once more, her shawl drawn close. She held a lantern low, though the moon did much of the lighting for her. She walked the path in silence. She did not need to look to know where each plant grew. She had tended them with her hands for years. She had spoken softly to them, not in prayer, but in wonder. Here was the rue, bluish and strong. Here was the woodruff, sweet and hiding under leaves. There was the borage, whose tiny star-shaped flowers always seemed to look upward. She crouched beside a row of lavender and let her fingers trail across the tops. The scent rose like a side dot all around her. The garden whispered, not in words, but in presence, the kind of presence that asked for nothing, gave nothing, but simply was. In the chapel beyond the garden, the final bell had long since faded. The convent was asleep. Only the night insects sang now, and the low rustle of leaves moving gently in the breeze. Sister Magda reached a stone bench near the back wall. She sat and waited. She did this most nights, not for visions or voices or heavenly signs, but for the stillness. And sometimes, in that stillness, she felt something like a breath upon her cheek, something like warmth on the back of her hands, a quiet knowing that life, all around her, was continuing even in the dark, even in silence, even in sleep. Tonight, as she sat beneath the moon, she took a petal from her pocket, a violet pressed between pages of an old book on healing humors. She laid it on the bench beside her and closed her eyes. She did not pray in the usual way. She did not fold her hands. She simply let her thoughts slow, her shoulders ease, her breath soften. And in that still, blue hour, the garden prayed with her, not with words, with petals, with beeswax, and leaf shadow, and the scent of night lavender, with all the quiet ancient things that did not need to be explained. Inside the scriptorium, a faint golden light glowed through the slats of the wooden shutters. The garden outside slumbered, but within those stone walls, a single candle still flickered. Sister Anselma, whose fingertips were stained with ink and smudged with parchment dust, sat at her workbench, gently turning the pages of an old herbal. Her head was bent, her posture still, but her thoughts wandered quietly through the stories in the margins, little notes written in delicate Latin, small drawings of leaves and roots beside carefully penned remedies. The candle sputtered softly, and she leaned back for a moment. The scent of dried ink and beeswax clung to the air. The coals in the hearth across the room glowed dully, radiating a sleepy warmth that settled into her bones. She reached for a jar of elderflower tincture. It was kept on the highest shelf, sealed with linen and tied with a red string. She opened it slowly, dipping a single finger inside, then dabbing a drop beneath her nose. It was a custom passed from one sister to the next, to dream gently. They said, one must breathe gently, and elderflower softened the edge between waking and sleep. She set the jar down and reached for her quill, but she didn't write. She held it still between her fingers, listening to the distant hush of the wind outside, to the gentle creak of timber above her, to the rhythmic beat of her own heart. All across the convent, candles had been snuffed, yet here, in this quiet room, one remained. She opened her own notebook, the one she kept beneath the herbal pages. It was not a book of formal learning, not one the abbess would ask to inspect. It was filled with thoughts, small poems, herbal dreams, and questions she didn't speak aloud. She flipped to a page she had once filled after tending the garden during a rainstorm. On it, she had written, "Today I smelled the roots after the rain. They carried something older than memory, something that made me feel remembered." She smiled faintly at the lines. Outside, the garden's soil rested, damp and dreaming beneath its leaf-laced blankets. Inside, Sister Anselma dipped her pen into the ink again, and beneath the steady flicker of the candle, she began to write a new entry. "The night is soft tonight. The plants do not sleep as we do. They hum. I wonder if the moon hears them." A small moth fluttered near the flame, hovering just at the edge of light. She watched it circle once, then vanish again into shadow. There was something comforting in that motion. Here in this little scriptorium, lit by beeswax and memory, Anselma felt no rush. The words would come slowly, just like petals unfolding, one by one. Without force, without fear. Beneath the dormitory's timber-poured ceiling, rows of beds lay dressed in soft linen sheets, worn smooth by years of washing and sun-drying on the cloister line. The convent had grown still now. Sisters who had worked with steady hands through daylight now slept with steady breath, wrapped in their own quiet dreams. At the far end of the long dormitory, where the last window opened toward the eastern sky, Sister Bruna shifted beneath her blanket. Her hands were tucked beneath her cheek. Her dreams, slow and shadowless, meandered through memories of rosemary bundles and long-ago festivals, with doves released at dawn. By her bedside, a small sachet of dried lavender and lemon balm had been placed, sewn into a soft square of flax cloth. The scent had faded over the years, yet still held enough presence to gently fill the air around her pillow. There was no sound in the room, save for the occasional rustle of fabric or the long creak of beams overhead when the night wind pushed softly through the upper eaves. Sister Bruna, whose hands once stitched every habit worn in the convent, had long passed her years of rising before the bell. Now, she rose with the sun when it pleased her, and yet, even in sleep, her fingers moved gently, as though turning imaginary hems or tying dream-threaded knots. The moonlight filtered in through the high glass panes, casting silver pools along the smooth stone floor. Dust motes, stirred by the motion of a breeze, danced in the cold light, like sleeping seeds caught in a dream. In the adjoining chamber, old Sister Columba stirred just slightly in her sleep. Her bed was smaller, placed beside a warm corner wall. There, a quilt lay draped with patches of sage green and earthen gold, hand-stitched from robes long since retired. Each square whispered a story, one from the harvest feast, one from the years of drought, one from the year the king's horse broke its leg outside the convent gate and the sisters nursed it back to health. Columba's dreams tonight were quiet ones. She dreamt of braiding long stalks of wheat, of carrying linen in baskets still warm from the sun. In her dream, a younger version of herself knelt beside a girl with scraped knees, applying a comfrey poultice while humming an old lullaby passed down from her grandmother. The garden's scent had crept in through the open dormitory window, hips and cool dew, time still holding on to warmth from the day. It mingled with the herbal pouches and the faint scent of beeswax from the corridor lamp. Even the floor, polished with vinegar and rosemary oil, gave off a sleepy, familiar fragrance. The nuns slept like old trees rooted and wrapped in rings of memory. Some smiled softly in their sleep, some lay still as stone, and above them, outside the thick stone walls, the stars shifted across the sky in slow procession. The same stars they had sung to during Vespers now kept watch. The convent did not need locks. Its walls were held together by rhythm, by custom, and by the breath of women who listened closely to the language of silence. And in that stillness, the garden rested, its roots curled into the soil, its leaves tucked beneath shadows, its flowers closed tight as prayer. Morning came softly to the convent, before the bell, before the bustle of dawn footsteps, or the rustle of robes. Light crept slowly through the high windows of the herbarium. It arrived, not as brilliance, but as a gentle wash of pale gold, brushing the stone floor, glinting off glass bottles, and warming the backs of wooden chairs. This room, tucked just beside the garden, was the quiet heart of the convent's healing. Rows of shelves lined the walls, each holding carefully labeled jars: nettle leaf, ground valerian, crushed juniper berry, elderflower, lemon balm, dried violet, angelica root. Scrolls and little codices lay stacked beside them, filled with hand-inked notes on tinctures and teas, salves and syrups. Sister Tamsin, the youngest of the herb keepers, had risen early today. She moved barefoot across the flagstone floor, her woolen shawl wrapped loosely around her shoulders. Her candle flickered with each passing breath, its tiny flame mirrored in the polished curve of a copper still. She was not there to work, not yet. She was simply keeping company with the silence. With her fingers, she traced the outline of a vellum sheet, laid open on the desk a diagram of a poppy pod, drawn with the finest hand and annotated with a recipe for sleep. Syrup meant for travelers suffering from long night roads. From a nearby shelf, she selected a jar labeled Somnaria Blend and opened it just briefly. The scent rose, slowly, wild chamomile and a hint of dried pear blossom. It was a blend meant not only for dreamers, but for the restless, the grieving, and the quietly unsettled. Tamsin replaced the lid gently. She didn't need the tea herself, not yet, but she liked to imagine what sort of dreams it gave. Did they unfold slowly, like morning glories under sun? Did they wander into distant cities or past lives long forgotten? Behind her, the ivy-framed window looked out over the garden's northern path. Morning dew clung to every leaf, each droplet catching the light like tiny glass beads. The bees had not yet begun their rounds, and the petals remained curled, sleepy and untouched. The herbarium smelled of lavender wood, melted wax, old paper, and sweet herbal dust. It was a smell, Tamsin, associated with wisdom and patience, with the kind of knowledge gathered not in haste, but in hours spent watching, listening, waiting. She stepped softly to the basin and filled her palms with cool rosewater. It had been steeped overnight with petals collected at dusk, and it carried the garden's memory of evening. She pressed the water gently to her cheeks and temples, letting its coolness melt into her skin, then dried her hands on the corner of her apron. There were no bells yet. The others still slept, and so she returned to the large oak chair in the corner, the one that creaked in just the right comforting way, and curled into it with her shawl drawn high. There, in the hush before daybreak, she closed her eyes and breathed. She imagined the garden stretching, yawning, reaching leafy arms toward the sun. She imagined the petals unfolding one by one, not in a hurry, but in rhythm, a rhythm that matched her breath. Inhale and pause, exhale and soften. The convent would wake soon, but for now, there was only peace, only warmth and wood, and the quiet dreams of herbs that once lived in moonlight and now waited in jars, ready to comfort those in need. Beyond the herbarium, behind the oldest wing of the convent, A narrow path wound its way between tall, swaying fennel stalks and clumps of sweetgrass. Few ever noticed it. The cobbles there were uneven, softened at the edges by moss and seasons of rain. Tiny blue flowers peeked through the cracks. Some nuns believed they only bloomed in places that held secrets. Sister Alodia, who had tended the garden for more than 30 years, often walked this path when her thoughts grew tangled. She said it had a way of listening, and that sometimes, if one walked slow enough, the wind would answer back. She moved gently now, her sandals brushing the fallen rosemary needles scattered like tiny green stars across the stones. Her veil was pinned with a silver clasp in the shape of a wheat stalk, and she carried with her a small cloth satchel filled with dried calendula and a bitty of lavender bread wrapped in linen. This morning, the air was damp and fragrant. Somewhere above, a dove cooed softly from the eaves. Beneath her feet, the stones were warm from yesterday's sun, and around her, the garden seemed to hush, holding its breath as the sun slipped higher, spilling filtered gold through the vines overhead. She stopped at a bend in the path, where an old marble bench waited beneath a rose arch. The bench was cool and slightly cracked, its corners worn round by time and touch. No one sat here but Alodia. She placed her satchel beside her and sat down slowly, her joints creaking softly, like wood in an old chapel. Before her, the petals of the climbing roses shivered in the breeze. They were white, veined faintly with green, and they only ever opened at mid-morning. Their scent was light and dreamy, something between milk and honey and memory. She closed her eyes. In her mind, she remembered planting this arch with Sister Domitilla decades ago. She could still hear the laughter, the tug of roots, the way the rain had surprised them both. Halfway through their digging, they had run barefoot, robes clutched high, feet slapping through puddles. She smiled at the memory, worn but soft, like a well-loved page. A bee passed nearby with a sound like a question. She answered in silence, nodding her head gently. Behind her, the path curved further, leading to a place few ever reached, a sunken alcove lined with crumbling stone pots and little clay faces, nestled among the ivy. She would go there soon, but for now, she rested, the soft hum of the earth beneath her, the lull of bees in bloom, the hush of vines brushing one another. In the morning, it was enough. Her fingers moved slowly over her linen, satseka from inside. She withdrew a folded square of waxed paper. Within it was a tiny pressed flower, almost translucent, a pale shade of blue with silver threading along its edge. Dreamleaf, it was called. It bloomed once a year at twilight, and was said to open the gates of calm. For medicine, not for tonic, but for stillness. She had kept this one for decades, tucked between psalms and prayers in her garden journal. She had brought it out today, not to study it, but to honor it. And so, as the garden stretched awake around her, Alodia lay the delicate blossom on the old marble bench and whispered softly, "For the dreamers yet to come." Then she stood, her bones slow, but her heart clear, and she stepped off the path again, letting the moss guide her feet. Around her, the garden seemed to lean in, brushing her sleeves, swaying gently with her passing, not clinging. Not calling. Just accompanying like an old friend who needs no words at all. Far above the garden path, beyond the arches and cloisters, the scriptorium watched quietly through its high, narrow windows. The scent of rosemary and lemon balm often reached here by mid-morning, curling through the shutters like a gentle hand. Sister Agnes sat by the light. Her desk was worn smooth by years of parchment, her inkwell shallow and stained. She held her quill not just with care, but with reverence. Each letter she penned was part of something sacred, but even sacred things need silence. And today, she paused more often than she wrote. Below, the garden shimmered in waves of sunlit green. She could see Sister Alodia's veil moving along the far path, a soft flicker of grey and ivory through the fennel stalks. The sight warmed her heart. She had been one of the youngest novices when Alodia taught her the names of plants. A name, Alodia used to say, is a kind of prayer. Say it slowly, it will teach you how to listen. Agnes let her eyes drift from the garden to the window's edge. A sparrow was dust-bathing on the ledge, wings fluffed and twitching with pleasure, sending tiny clouds into the air with each joyful wiggle. She smiled. Such simple things, she thought, and yet they made the soul feel full. A soft breeze rustled her parchment. She reached out to steady it, her fingertips brushing the dried ink. She closed the psalter, tied it loosely with twine, and stood. Her knees ached a bit. Copying scripture was not a kind task for the spine, but she moved with quiet grace. Her sandals whispered across the floor, past Sister Katharina, who nodded gently without looking up, past the inkstone, where drops of dried pigment shimmered like tiny rainbows, and down the winding stair that led toward the chapel, and, eventually, to the garden. She would take the long way, she decided, through the vestibule, then beneath the cloister arch that opened into the heart of green. That way, she could pass the old fountain. It had not flowed in years, but the stone basin still held rainwater after a storm, and sometimes, if the sky was kind, a few lily pads drifted across its surface. Outside, the sunlight was beginning to soften, angled, just enough to catch the edges of the convent wall in gold. Agnes stepped into it slowly. The change from stone to soil always gave her pause. The way her feet sank slightly into the earth, the way the breeze felt less filtered, more alive. She drew a slow breath and closed her eyes for just a moment. Birdsong circled her. A blackcap sang from the fig tree by the apothecary's door. Bees murmured nearby, their wings brushing time. And somewhere in the distance, the faint clang of someone's bucket echoed a reminder that even in peace, life moved gently forward. She opened her eyes again, and there, at the far end of the main garden, stood Sister Alodia, bent slightly over a patch of pale green. Agnes smiled. She would join her in a while, but first, she turned left, toward the fountain. Its bowl was dappled with shadow. A few leaves drifted there, and one lazy dragonfly skated the surface. She crouched by its edge, and touched the cool rim of stone. She remembered when water flowed here daily, when the sound of it had been a constant lull between prayers. She missed that. But still, the silence here was not empty. It had been filled, instead, by birds, by wind, by the rustling of ivy over stone, by quiet footsteps, by the murmur of hands brushing petals, and by breath, always breath. She lingered a while, letting her fingertips skim the water. Tiny rings spread outward with each touch, like forgotten bells rippling in memory. Then she stood and walked the path toward Sister Alodia, her steps steady and slow, and as she passed the border of lavender and sage, the scent lifted all around her, cool and calming, like prayer made into air. The lavender grew thick at the edge of the convent garden, where the sun struck most strongly. In the late afternoon, its stems stood tall and swayed gently in the breeze, crowned with dusky violet. Bees hummed over it in lazy circles, drunk on scent, wings catching glints of amber light. Sister Agnes stepped carefully along the path. Each step was soft, each movement slow. Her sandals stirred little clouds of dust as she moved beside the old lavender beds. The scent lifted into the air, floral and dry, clinging to the folds of her habit and brushing across her cheeks like a hush. Sister Alodia was bent over a low basket nearby. She looked up when Agnes approached, her eyes calm and shining beneath the shade of her veil. "Come," she said gently, her voice barely louder than the wind. "The feverfew is ready." Agnes lowered herself beside her, knees pressing into the grass, the warmth of the earth pressing back. Together, in silence, they began to snip small bundles of pale yellow flowers, their centers tight and round, each bloom tucked with care into linen wrappings. Alodia had taught her the rhythm: cut, pause, press, breathe in, cut again, wrap. It was a meditation as much as a task. The sun slipped lower. Shadows stretched long. Somewhere behind them, a bell rang out, a soft chime, not a summons, just a marking of time. Perhaps it was the 3rd hour after none, or perhaps it didn't matter. Here in the garden, time moved differently. They worked until the basket filled, not with haste, not with words, just motion and stillness, breath and bloom. When at last they rose, Alodia pressed a bundle of feverfew into Agnes's hands. "For your dreams," she said. Agnes held it gently. "You still believe in that?" she asked softly, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Alodia nodded once. "I do. Some herbs open the body, others open the heart, but a rare few," she added, brushing a bit of lavender from her sleeve, "open the dreams." They began to walk again, side by side now, past the rosemary hedge, tall and fragrant, past the hollyhocks rising like pink and cream trumpets, toward the far wall, where ivy climbed in thick ropes and the air grew cooler. There, beneath a small archway of stone, sat an old wooden bench. It was cracked from years of sun, but still strong. Sister Agnes sat, and Elodia followed. In the quiet that followed, only the soft click of bees could be heard. Agnes looked up at the sky. A few clouds drifted there, pale and thin, like scraps of wool caught in a breeze. But the presence of peace. She whispered the Latin words once, barely louder than a breath, Casit icinema. Here the soul rests. And then, as the sky paled gently outside her window, she closed her eyes again and drifted deeper into stillness, deeper into warmth, deeper into sleep. As the convent stirred beneath the slow bloom of morning, Sister Thomasine rose from her straw-filled mattress. With a quiet breath and a soft smile, she had always risen before the others, not from duty, but from rhythm. Her body moved like clockwork, gentle, silent, steady, as though her breath itself followed the turning of some unseen hourglass. She lit the stub of a beeswax candle, its glow spreading slowly across the small stone chamber. The walls were cool, painted with shadows. Her wooden crucifix hung above the basin, and beside it, a single linen towel folded with care. Thomasine dipped her hands in the water and brought them to her face. The cold stung slightly, but it cleared the lingering cobwebs of sleep. She liked this hour best, the one before the bells. It was neither night nor day, neither prayer nor work. It was a space between, a pause in the breath of the world. She unlatched the small window. Outside, the sky was a soft ash blue, dusted with the faintest hint of rose at the edge of the horizon. A single black bird called once, then fell quiet again. Thomasine stood for a moment with her hands on the sill, her breath rising in small puffs into the cool air. Below her, the garden lay untouched. She watched as the breeze stirred the tallest fennel stalks and sent the lavender into a slow, swaying dance. That garden had taught her more about time than any bell or book. The plants never rushed, they never fretted. Each leaf, each petal, each curling vine followed a rhythm older than thought. Even in winter, when all seemed still and bare, the garden was moving beneath the surface roots, threading quietly through the soil, seeds sleeping with a patience she envied. She had tended the garden since she was 15, now past 50, with silver threading through her dark braid. She still walked its paths each morning, her fingers brushing the herbs as gently as one might touch the edge of a sacred page. Her favorite spot was the far corner, just beside the crumbling stone bench. That's where the oldest lavender grew, its roots tangled deep, its stems gnarled, but its blooms still strong and fragrant. That plant had outlasted harsh winters and scorching summers. It had survived floods, snows, and one careless novice who had nearly uprooted it during a weeding session. It had endured. Like her, she thought of the hourglass again. It wasn't made of sand or glass, not really. It was inside her. Time, not by grains, but by breaths, steps, silences. She moved slowly now, by choice. Every action deliberate, every gesture shaped by care. Even the act of tying her worn leather shoes became a kind of quiet ritual loop. Pull, not pause. There was no hurry. Not anymore. She remembered when she had first arrived, wild-eyed and sharp-tongued, sent by a mother who did not understand her. The silence of the convent had been unbearable then. The garden had seemed useless, dull, and too slow. But over time, the rhythm of leaves replaced the noise in her mind. Over time, the quiet became a friend, and then, a teacher. She crossed the room and picked up her wooden rosary, the beads cool and smooth in her fingers. She did not pray aloud, she rarely did. Instead, she held each bead like a moment, a breath, a seed. She looked again toward the garden, still cloaked in the gentle shadows of dawn. A single bee drifted near the open window, bumping softly along the sill, its wings buzzing like a secret hymn. Thomasine smiled. She whispered to it, almost as one would to a child, "Your early little one." The bee turned, circled once, then disappeared into the cool blue air. She watched it vanish beyond the roofline, then turned back toward her small writing desk. There, beside her inkpot and parchment, sat a tiny hourglass just 3 inches tall, made of brass and bone. It had been her father's, gifted to her the day she took her vows. She turned it once each morning, never to time anything, but to remember. To remember how the sand moved, slow, soft, unhurried, just like the breath, just like the seasons, just like her. With the faintest smile, she reached for the glass now, turned it gently in her hand, and watched as the first grain fell. Then, the next dot, and the next. Each one a promise, each one a prayer, each one a quiet hymn to stillness. Asterisk beneath a rounded arch near the eastern cloister, nestled in the oldest corner of the convent, lay the herb room. Its walls were thick with age, made of pale limestone softened by centuries of breath and weather. Moss crept along the outer edges of the stones, and in the spring, tiny blue flowers pushed through the cracks like timid guests invited in by the warming air. Inside, the scent was like no other place in the convent. At once earthy, sharp, and comforting. Dried rosemary hung from the rafters. Lavender, marjoram, and thyme were bundled in neat rows along the upper beams, their stems bound tightly with twine. On the heavy wooden shelves stood jars of preserved petals, roots, seeds, and powders, all labeled in Sister Thomasin's careful script. The air was always cool and dim. A small stained glass window cast colors on the stone floor, blue like cornflowers, green like mint, and yellow like chamomile. This room held more than medicine. It held memory. Each jar and bundle carried a season, a story, a day once lived, and now held still in scent. On this morning, Sister Thomasin entered alone. The bell for prime would not ring for another half hour. She moved through the space without needing to look. Her fingers reached for a sprig of valerian root. Then to the clay jar marked Angelica. She opened it, leaned in, and inhaled deeply. The scent brought clarity to her thoughts, like cold water over warm skin. At the center table, she unrolled a square of linen, then reached for the mortar and pestle, stone on stone. Slow and deliberate, she crushed the dried leaves, not into powder, but into memory. The sound was steady and grounding. She remembered using this very pestle for the first time as a girl, trembling with nervous energy under the firm but patient eye of Sister Berta, who had once tended the herb room long before her. Sister Berta's hands had been lined like tree bark. Her voice had smelled faintly of peppermint. She never scolded, only guided. Thomasin smiled at the memory. Now she, too, had become the one with lined hands and a peppermint-scented voice. It had crept upon her. Quietly this changed, this passing of role and season. From novice to steward, from student to keeper, from uncertain girl to quiet anchor. She gathered the crushed herbs into a small pouch, tied it with linen thread, and set it aside for the infirmary. It would ease Sister Magda's breathing on cold nights. She moved next to a row of small amber bottles, each stoppered and waxed. She checked their seals, tested one, added a drop of tincture onto a scrap of linen, and sniffed. Strong but pure. No mold, no time lost. Satisfied, she cleaned the pestle, wiped the table, and watered the small potted hyssop by the window, an experiment from the prior spring that still held on, green and faithful. She paused there for a moment, her hand resting against the cool terracotta pot. A breeze stirred through the tiny arched window. It brushed against her cheek like a whisper, and she closed her eyes. Somewhere beyond the wall, a dove cooed, and then silence again. Stillness. The hourglass in her room would nearly be empty now. The bell would soon ring. But here, inside these thick old walls, the minutes bent. They softened like petals pressed between pages. She opened her eyes and looked once more around the herb room. No one had spoken here in years, not aloud, yet the silence was full. It spoke through scent and color, through wood and dust, through every bundled stalk and careful label. This was her sanctuary. Not just a place of healing, but a place of remembering. And perhaps a place where time bowed its head and stood still. In a quiet chamber beside the scriptorium, Sister Lenny sat at her desk with the shutters drawn halfway open. The daylight streamed through in soft stripes, painting the old wooden floor in golden shadow. Her desk was simple oak, darkened with age, its surface worn smooth, where countless elbows had rested and countless thoughts had been penned. Before her lay a single sheet of fresh parchment, creamy and waiting. The inkpot was full. Her quill had been trimmed just that morning, and yet she had not yet written a word. Not because she didn't know what to write, but because some thoughts needed stillness before they could become sentences. Outside the window, the garden hummed gently. She could not see it from where she sat, but she could hear it. A bee drifting past, the faint rustle of sage leaves, a bird chirping and then falling silent. She dipped her quill into the ink and began, not with a name or a title, but with a feeling. Her script, shaped in slender loops, spilled carefully across the page. She wrote to no one in particular, to herself, to time, to anyone who might one day find her words, folded and forgotten. This morning, I watched you gather on the edge of the lemon balm. It clung to the tips like silver pearls, unmoving. And I wondered if, perhaps, all the world is held together by pauses we cannot see, quiet, like threads, holding everything in place. She paused, listened. The wind shifted faintly. She kept writing. The garden behind the convent wall feels different at dawn. It feels like it is breathing, as if the flowers exhale once the night has passed. No one speaks of this, but I think the others feel it too. The way Sister Thomasine hums a little softer when she gathers mint, the way Brother Giles lowers his eyes when he walks past the roses. We do not say it, but the garden hears us. She set the quill down and flexed her hand gently. The ink shimmered while it dried. Sometimes she imagined her letters were small spells, not spells to change the world, just spells to remember it, to remember how lemon balm smells after rain, how time crumbles between fingertips, how silence can hold more love than words ever could. A breeze caught the edge of the parchment, lifting it slightly as though it too wished to read. She placed a smooth stone her paperweight on the corner, and smiled. That stone had come from the garden wall itself, chipped loose during a storm to winters past. It was pale, rounded, and cool to the touch. She always used it when writing in this room, to keep her grounded, to remind her that words and earth were never truly separate. Rising, she walked to the window and opened it wider. The scent of sage, warm from the sun, drifted in. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The breeze touched her cheek. She listened. From beyond the garden came the gentle sound of Sister Agnes plucking weeds near the violets. No one spoke. And still everything was saying something. She returned to her desk and carefully folded the parchment. She tucked it into the wooden box with the others. Not to be read now. Not yet. But maybe someday, when silence was needed, they would be found, and someone, somewhere, would breathe a little slower and smile. Night returned slowly, as it always did behind the convent wall, soft and unhurried, like a shawl drawn gently over a dozing world. Candles had been lit, the bell had tolled the final prayer, and silence now cloaked the cloisters like velvet. Sister Magda moved with practiced grace, her bare feet soundless upon the stones of the corridor. In her arms, she carried a woven basket. Inside were linen pouches of dried lavender, stitched that very morning. Tonight, she would place one at the edge of each sister's pillow, a gift of rest, of stillness, of dreams. The scent trailed behind her like a lullaby. She entered each chamber in silence, her movements tender, reverent. She paused at the doorway of Sister Lenny's room. A faint glow shimmered from the candle on the desk. Lenny was not asleep. She sat with her hands folded over her heart, eyes closed, breathing quietly. Magda did not speak. She simply placed the lavender pouch upon the folded blanket at the foot of the bed, and bowed her head before stepping away. Down the hallway, a breeze stirred through the open window at the end of the corridor. It carried the faint perfume of rosemary and earth. Even in darkness, the garden offered its breath. Magda descended the stairs into the kitchen, where the fire had been banked low, and the air was heavy with warmth and ash. A pot of nettle broth sat covered for the morning. And yet, her eyes drifted to the window, to the sliver of moon above the stone wall. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Tonight, she would visit the garden one last time before sleep. The door creaked open. Just a little. Cool night air swept over her skin. She stepped outside. Her feet met the worn path with familiarity. The gravel had shifted under thousands of steps across the seasons, and yet it always felt the same welcoming. Knowing, gentle, the garden lay ahead in shadow and silver. The moon had risen high now, and everything shimmered. The lavender bushes glowed faintly. The mint leaves curled in on themselves. Dreaming, Magda wandered slowly, her fingers trailing along the heads of chamomile and fennel. She moved toward the elder tree, the tallest in the garden. Beneath its branches, the air always felt hushed, as though even the stars dared not speak too loudly. There she knelt, not in prayer exactly, but in something older, quieter. She took from her shawl a small satchel of seeds, yarrow, hyssop, and dreamwort. She had dried them in secret, had waited for the proper moon, and now, with the garden watching, she pressed each seed into the earth. Her hands moved slowly, with care, like writing a letter the soil would one day answer. For though they were nuns and gardeners and healers, they were also stewards of mysteries that could not be explained, only lived. The wind curled around her shoulders, and in the distance, the convent bell gave a single chime. She knew then it was time to sleep. She rose, brushing the soil from her hands, whispered a thank you to the elder tree, and walked back toward the warm light of the doorway, where dreams and herbs would mingle in the hush of sleep. By morning, the wind had shifted. It blew softly from the east, where the hills undulated like folded cloth beneath the rising sun. Within the convent garden, the wisteria vines swayed on their wooden trellis, petals falling like snowflakes across the worn flagstones. Sister Therese stood beneath the archway where the vines clung, brushing aside a strand of pale purple flowers as she stepped into the courtyard. In her hands, she held a small brass bowl. Inside, crushed rose petals and a handful of wood ash dots. She was preparing the wash for the altar. Cloths a tradition on quiet mornings after prayer. But her feet paused at the center of the garden path. There was something in the air that stilled her breath. It wasn't just the fragrance of herbs and the warmth of sunlit earth. It was something else. A hush, a gentle hum that seemed to rise from the ground itself. She glanced toward the far end of the wall, where the elder tree swayed softly in the breeze. The soil at its roots looked freshly turned, though Sister Therese said nothing. Her heart recognized the rhythm of quiet ritual. Some things did not need to be spoken. Some knowing passed from one soul to another, like the slow lighting of candles. She knelt by the rosemary patch, fingers brushing over the sprigs. She whispered a blessing as she picked just enough for the day's tea. Her voice was like the wind, thin and sweet and fleeting. As she walked back toward the laundry basin, she noticed that the bees had returned, not in a hurry, not in clusters, but a few drifting lazily among the thyme and the dill. The garden was slowly waking again. In the scriptorium, Sister Lenny had already opened the window shutters to let in the morning light. Dust motes danced in golden shafts across the pages of vellum, and the soft scratch of her quill filled the chamber with rhythm. She wrote carefully, copying a hymn that had long been forgotten by most churches beyond their walls. A hymn of green things, of the moon's grace and the patience of roots. The ink flowed like water, steady and quiet, and the parchment welcomed each stroke as if it too remembered. Outside the window, the garden stretched wide beneath the morning sun. The shadows had softened, the lavender stirred, the hollyhocks nodded slowly on their stalks, their petals catching droplets of dew that sparkled like glass beads. Far in the corner, near the moss-covered stone bench, the cat had returned. The grey tabby, soft and silent as a whisper, curled into a perfect circle among the marjoram. She had been born in the garden years ago, in the cradle of a broken pot, and now she slept there still, a quiet guardian of roots and silence. The sisters moved through their morning with the same care they gave to their prayers. One washed linens, one tended the pages of scripture, one prepared bread in the oven room, flour dusting her sleeves like first snow. And yet, all of them, each in her own corner of the world, felt something, a stillness, a bloom just beneath the surface, as if the garden itself held breath, waiting for something soft and golden to open in its own time. The bell called them. Then, a single toll echoing across the cloisters, they gathered in the chapel, their footsteps padding gently, robes brushing stone. Outside, the wind sighed through the wisteria once more, a lullaby for herbs, 4 sisters, 4 seeds that dream in silence. That afternoon, after the midday meal and the silent reflection that followed, Sister Marguerite slipped quietly into the little library behind the cloisters. It was the warmest room in the convent, lined with shelves that bowed slightly under the weight of handwritten books and herbal scrolls. The window faced west, where the sunlight slanted through grapevine shadows and danced across the tiled floor. She carried with her a small leather-bound book, its cover cracked and darkened with age, its pages thick and soft as pressed linen. The herb journal, passed from one generation of sisters to the next. It held not just recipes and remedies, but dreams, observations made in careful ink, when a plant bloomed early, or how a certainty calmed the nerves on stormy nights. It was more than a record, it was a conversation, a soft thread connecting women across decades. Entry like a gentle voice whispering through time. Marguerite sat at the little wooden desk beside the window. She dipped her pen in the inkwell, then paused. Her fingers brushed the edge of the page where Sister Aveline had once written about feverfew. and above that, Sister Therese's notes on the scent of chamomile during rain. She smiled, then added her own. The marjoram stirred last night beneath the stars. I woke to its song, and felt calm before I even rose from bed. I believe it opens more fully at moonrise, when the air is cool and still. She signed with her initial, a small M beside a curling vine drawn in the margin. From the window, she could see the garden beginning to blush in late afternoon light. The shadows stretched gently along the wall. Birds flitted from perch to perch in the fig tree, their wings stirring the air with barely a sound. A soft breeze fluttered the herb, journal's page, and Marguerite reached to steady it. She lingered, her hand resting lightly on the old words, as if listening for what they might whisper next. Down in the kitchen, the water for evening tea had begun to simmer. Sister Eleanor added fresh lemon balm and a few mint leaves to the pot, watching as they danced in the heat. The aroma filled the stone kitchen, curling out into the hallway and toward the garden door. Even the cat, still curled among the marjoram, flicked her tail once at the scent. The peace of the place was not loud or dramatic. It was slow. It hummed, gently, like a lullaby made of leaves and warmth and time. In the stillness, no one rushed, no one strained to be heard. There was only the rhythm of breathing, of the bell's soft echo in the distance, and the fragrance of tea weaving through the air like silk dot as the sun dipped lower behind the cloister walls. The garden seemed to lean inward, petals turning subtly toward one another, vines relaxing into their lattice, and from a far corridor, a soft chime rang. It was time for vespers. Sister Marguerite closed the herb journal gently and placed it back on the shelf. She let her fingers rest on its spine for a heartbeat longer. Then she turned, wrapped in the warmth of quiet knowing, and stepped out into the amber light. Outside, the garden waited half in shadow, half in gold, still listening, still dreaming. As twilight folded gently across the convent grounds, Sister Therese lit the first lantern by the garden gate. It was an old ritual, simple and quiet. One lantern at the entrance, one along the fig tree path, and another near the well where the mint grew thick and fragrant. Each glass lantern held a stubby beeswax candle that gave off the faint scent of honey and smoke. As she moved barefoot over the garden stones, her steps were slow, careful, almost like a prayer. The gravel crunched softly beneath her soles. The breeze lifted the hem of her robe just slightly, brushing her ankles with the cool hush of nightfall. She paused beneath the fig tree, lifting the second lantern and cupping her hand around the flame to shield it from the wind. The fire flickered gently, then steadied. Its glow spilled onto the path, casting a warm halo over the green leaves and the low moss-covered bench nearby. This was a sacred hour, not because of ceremony or scripture, but because the earth itself seemed to breathe differently here, more slowly, more tenderly. In the distance, the bell in the tower gave one soft chime, not loud, not calling, just a reminder. Evening had arrived. Back inside, Sister Eleanor prepared the final tea of the day, lavender and verbena steeped in warm clay pots. The scent drifted into the corridors, curling around corners, finding its way into every quiet room. The sisters who wished for it would come with their wooden mugs and sit on low stools near the hearth, some in silence, others murmuring about seedlings, candle wax, or dreams they had half remembered from sleep. But Therese stayed in the garden. She placed the third lantern near the edge of the well and sat on the stone rim, listening to the water far below. There was something peaceful in its depth, something ancient. She leaned forward and peered inside, not to see her reflection, but to feel the coolness of the stone, the weight of still water, the presence of something older than memory. Behind her, the marjoram leaves shifted, then settled again. The cat appeared, winding softly between her ankles, purring like a sleepy lullaby. Therese reached down and gently stroked the cat's back. "Even you feel it, don't you?" she whispered. The hush, the warmth that comes not from sun, but from quiet. The sky above had turned the color of faded violets, dusky and pale, and the stars had just begun to blink into being, one by one, as if lit from behind the sky by careful hands. She closed her eyes. She breathed in mint, honey, candle smoke, damp stone, lavender in the air. Each sent a note in the quiet symphony of night, each breath slower than the last. The lantern flames danced gently, never fighting the dark, only softening it. That was how the sisters lived, not in resistance to the world, but in rhythm with it, not in conquest, but in calm. And the garden too. understood. It didn't strive or chase. It opened, slowly. Under the stars, the leaves rustled like whispers. The soil breathed. The blossoms yawned, and all around her, the convent exhaled, a slow, contented sigh that rose like mist into the soft cloak of night. Asterisk in the stillness before true nightfall. The bees did not return to the hives all at once. They came slowly, drifting like golden flecks through the last light of day, their wings catching moonglow as they settled onto worn wooden ledges. Sister Claire watched them from her bench by the herb wall. She had been the keeper of the apiary for more than a dozen seasons, her fingers gentle and her voice low. She didn't believe in rushing bees. She believed in patience. They were not creatures of command, but of rhythm, and she trusted they knew more of balance than many men ever would. A soft buzzing still lingered near the sage flowers, but it had softened to a lullaby hum, like a thread of music sung by wings. Claire folded her hands over her lap and listened. In the distance, a night bird called, just once, then silence again. The bees were blessings, she often said, not just for their honey, thick and golden in clay pots, but for their message. Work without rush, serve without noise, and return home, always, to the stillness of dusk. She leaned back and let her gaze drift skyward. The stars were brighter, now, and the moon had climbed higher, wearing a halo of soft silver. It cast long shadows between the thyme beds and across the weathered stones of the garden walkways. Far across the garden, the lanterns still glowed quiet, flickering markers of peace. She imagined their light from above must look like stars nestled gently into the earth, as if heaven had placed a few of its own lights down among the mint and marjoram. She breathed in the night air slowly, as if tasting it. It carried the trace of beeswax and cool bark, of crushed lemon balm and the faint, sweet powder of dried chamomile. Her thoughts slowed, matching her breath, and within that stillness, the sound of the convent's old fountain rose softly, not loud or rushing, a gentle trickle over smooth stone, where water caught the moonlight and gave it back in ripples. Many of the sisters were already curled in their straw mattress beds, covered in light blankets woven from soft wool. They had said their final prayers not as duties, but as whispers, wishes sent into the hush like drifting seeds. Some had dreams, tucked beneath their pillows written on folded paper. Others needed none at all, content simply to rest in the presence of lavender and shadows. Claire remained outside just a moment longer, fingers lightly resting on the sleeve of her wool robe, eyes half closed. Then, quietly, she rose. She bowed her head not to the sky, nor to the hives, but to the quiet itself. And then, as if by shared instinct, the last bee landed home. It crept gently into its tiny wax chamber, and the hum of the garden fell silent, not empty, but whole, as if the night had taken a deep breath, and all within it now slept. In the quietest corner of the convent, where the stone corridors narrowed and the air turned cooler, sat the old scriptorium. Its walls were lined with wooden shelves, each bearing handwritten volumes, their spines worn smooth by time and touch. This was where Sister Amara spent her evenings, long after the bells had rung their final note. She preferred to write in the stillness, where no voices stirred and the candlelight trembled softly against parchment. Only a single flame burned beside her, a beeswax candle, slow melting and sweet-scented, its light golden and kind. She dipped her quill into the inkpot with practiced grace. No haste, no urgency. Each stroke of the pen curved like a drifting feather, each letter taking form as if it were blooming onto the page. Outside, the garden breathed in sleep, but inside the scriptorium, memory stirred. Tonight, she was copying the ancient text of the Book of Healing Fragrance, a manuscript passed from one sister to another for generations. It spoke not of medicine in the usual sense, but of scent, of how marjoram soothed sorrow, and clary sage lifted the veil of grief, how dried petals beneath a pillow might open the dripmagate, and how frankincense reminded the soul of its home. Amara believed in these things, not with blind faith, but with the quiet assurance of one who had seen lavender calm a shaking hand, and peppermint wake a grieving heart. She paused as her candle flickered. A soft creak sounded from the beams above, as if the old wood were breathing along with her. She looked up, smiling faintly. The walls never frightened her. They whispered, they remembered, they were part of the hush that held every breath, every footstep, every turn of the page in this holy place. She dipped the quill again. From time to time, she'd pressed dried leaves into the margins of her copy small gifts, to future hands who might read by candlelight as she did now. A sprig of lemon verbena, a single violet, a pinch of dried rosemary wrapped in linen. The sisters believed that scent survived where ink faded, and so she wrote not just for minds, but for hearts, for the senses, for sleep. Far off, a bell tolled once, just a soft chime, then stilled again. It was only to mark the hour, not to summon. The garden would be dark now, touched only by moonlight and memory. The bees were tucked away, the herbs slept in their beds, roots cradled in cool earth, their leaves washed in dew, and still, Amara wrote. She was not in a hurry to finish. Each letter was a blessing, each pause between words, a breath in prayer. When she finally placed her quill back into its carved holder, the candle was low, a tiny flame still dancing gently. She closed the book. Her hands lingered on the cover for a moment, and then she pressed her palms together and bowed her head, not out of duty, but out of love. She stood and took the candle in hand, its glow casting a soft circle ahead of her. As she stepped into the hallway, the hush welcomed her. The stone felt cool beneath her sandals. She passed beneath an arch where ivy curled quietly, and paused just once to look back at the scriptorium's door. Then she walked on, her light moving gently down the hall like a firefly in a dream. And the garden behind the convent wall slept deeper still. As morning neared and the stars grew faint above the cloister roof, a hush lingered, even as the world prepared to stir. Within the garden behind the convent wall, all was still. The first bird had not yet sung, the wind had not yet risen, only the silence moved, stretching like silk, between the branches and the stones. At the edge of the garden, near the worn wooden gate, a vine of white jasmine had opened a single blossom. It had waited through the night, curled in green and shadow, as if listening to the breath of the world. Now, it unfurled not with urgency, but with patience. Petals opened like a whisper, slow and complete, letting its scent rise gently into the cool air. Above, the sky began to pale, not yet blue, not yet gold, just the soft silver of beginning. Sister Amara had returned to her cell by then, her candle extinguished, her breath already slow with sleep. The scriptorium was dark once more, the ink bottles sealed, the pages pressed between leather and wood. In the kitchen, a covered bowl of dough waited on the counter, rising slowly in the warmth of yesterday's embers. And in the dormitory, the sisters slept. They dreamed of simple things, of time drying on twine, of soft woolen robes, of bees hovering above lavender, of the hush that lived in stone and story. Even the youngest among them, Sister Lena, whose thoughts often wandered, now rested deeply, her hand tucked beneath her cheek, a rosemary stem resting beside her on the pillow. Outside, the convent walls stood steady and unshaken. The world beyond might change, seasons would turn, and new faces would come to the gate. But within these walls, something enduring held fast, a rhythm slower than breath, a memory deeper than words, a garden that did not ask to be seen to keep blooming. And somewhere within its roots, in the shadowed soil beneath sage and mint and rue, the hush stirred softly, blessing every sleeper, every dreamer, every petal still to open. You are safe here, too. The night is not yet over. There is still time to rest, to be still, to drift. The jasmine has only just bloomed. Sleep now, sleep well, sleep deeply.